Welcome everybody to the annual Martin Doody Memorial Lecture for 2025. My name is John O'Keefe and I'm Chief Executive Officer with the Discovery Programme. And as I'm sure you're aware, the Discovery Programme is a research performing organisation established back in 1991, which is all around about the researching of the history of Ireland, primarily through its archaeology, and the sharing of that results as far and wide as we can. And also to connect that research and knowledge of and understanding of the past with other places and other people. So I'm very privileged here tonight to be introducing the lecture. And as part of the duties here, just to say a little bit about housekeeping guidelines for the night. Now, obviously, we're not in a venue, so I don't have to say a whole lot about escape venues and fire alarms and so on. Um, for each of us that's on the call here and for the presenters, we're not expecting to have to leave the building this evening, but if for whatever reason our internet connection goes down or we need to step away from the screens, if you give us a few moments, we'll see if we can re-establish the connections again. I'd be delighted if you would make use of the question and answer facility. So on the bottom of your screen, you'll see the usual wee list of icons that's there. And in the middle of it, there should be a little screen with a question mark on it. And if you do have questions that occur either during the presentations or at the end, pop them in there, and then myself and Hannah and Anthony will get through them, and all being well, we'll get a chance to go through the questions and chat them. So as we're talking now this evening, we have a fairly decent internet connection now, and finger crossed it'll stay that way for it. Now, the event is named in memory of late Martin Doody, who graduated in archaeology from University College in Cork, and he led one of the first major projects undertaken at the Discovery Programme, and was director of the Ballyhura Hills project from 1992 to 2002. Those results were then later published in the monograph number 7. And it's now sadly 10 years since Martin passed away. Now, as some of you may be aware, you've seen in previous talks, I didn't know Martin personally, but I did know him from his work and have continued to use his work almost day to day with some of the projects in the Discovery Programme are still involved in. I know I've been left with a deep impression of a scholar through the work that he conducted, and from those who knew him more closely, that he was a gentle, courteous, courageous, and affable person. He left a legacy for archaeology and for archaeologists, but he also left a legacy for wider society beyond his archaeology, and that was through his involvement with the Irish Kidney Association. So, while the Ballyhura Hills project and others are one of his legacies here, I'm very pleased to invite Colin White onto the call this evening, who is going to speak on behalf of the Irish Kidney Association and was somebody who did know Martin directly. So, Colin, if I could hand over to you.
Thank you very much. It's an absolute delight to be here, and I'm quite chuffed to say that I attended the very first one of these lectures 10 years ago. And as somebody who had the opportunity to know Martin for, I guess, 10, 12 years I knew him, it's really nice to remember him in this way. He was an absolute gentleman. A pleasure to just spend time with him, to listen to him, and kind of get his insights on life as well as on archaeology. So I'm just going to very quickly give you a little bit of a whistle-stop tour, if my technology decides to work. It does. Of Martin the man. He graduated from UCC in 1980. And it seems that Professor O'Kelly had quite a profound impact on kind of the direction of his career, and just his, I think he was kind of very responsible for lighting that spark of passion for all things archaeological whilst he was there. But he was diagnosed with diabetes when he was a student. So when he was in UCC, and apparently an uncle of his had been a diabetic, so there was a little bit of knowledge of it in the family. And when Martin got his diagnosis, there was a little bit of a family get together, and it was, Martin, is archaeology the smartest thing for a diabetic to do? Because you're still kind of back in the time where diabetes was a challenge rather than something that could be managed. And it was kind of, well, maybe you need to kind of reel it in a little bit and not have such I suppose a sense of enthusiasm for life. You need to kind of quell that a little bit to look after your health. But he plugged away with it anyway because he was fired up by it. And just there as an overview, he joined the IK in 95. He started dialysis in 96, so his kidney function would have dropped kind of below 10-15%. So he needed that kind of outside intervention of dialysis. And he was very fortunate to get a transplant kind of within by the following year, 97, and equally to get a kidney and pancreas transplant. That was very, very lucky. But as we go through the slides, we'll see he wasn't the best patient out there. He was he could be a little bit naughty. He was, after he graduated, he was taking a group up of first year students up Ard Patrick, and decided to collapse and faint. And apparently the students were kind of left kind of scratching their head. Well, what do we do now, and what do we do with him? And they found the insulin in his bag, and they were kind of like, do we inject him? Do we not inject him? But thankfully they got in touch with the local GP and sorted him out. And I think with the following day or 2 days later, he was back up the mountain with them again in typical Martin fashion. But as can happen with kidney transplants, Martin's kidney failed. His transplanted kidney failed in 2012, so he was back on dialysis. And again, exceptionally lucky to have got a second transplant later that same year. And then he had a further three years after that. His last 3 years, his health was quite compromised, and it did very much have an impact on what he could engage in. But I think his involvement with the Kinsale National Pipeline project was kind of, he was there really when archaeology, it's hard to say that archaeology started, given that it's about history, but when it was really taking hold in Ireland, like it was before there was any real decent legislation in place. But this gave the opportunity to examine a lot of virgin land. And from an article he wrote up for our magazine, they discovered and recorded 82 different sites as part of that project. But again, the nature of the work, and Martin not being the ideal patient, he was missing meals, he was missing appointments, the digs were just too interesting. And it had a bit of a long-term impact on his overall health. But it was in 91, as John said, it was the then Taoiseach, Charlie Haughey, who actually sort of said, look, we need to have an interest in and protect our heritage. And that's where the Discovery program was initiated. So in relation to the Kidney Association, Martin was living in Laois, so he became chairman of as a volunteer of our branch there. He joined the board in 2001, and in the subsequent years, he took on officer roles as secretary, treasurer, and national chairman. So a true leader and a servant at the same time. That as a staff member, I used to always enjoy when Martin would be in Donor House in Dublin, because he treated you with respect. He was interested. He wanted to learn. He wanted to know, but he realized that kind of the staff, we were steeped in all things kidney, organ donation, etc. Day after day. Yes, he had the lived personal experience, but he wanted to learn more. He was really a great listener, and a strong advocate for patients. Very down to earth, very very humble in his approach. So some of his impact under his kind of guidance, we saw a dialysis unit in Tullamore, which the Kidney Association actually funded the building, and the installation of it was a temporary building that ended up being there for a very long time, but it meant that people in the area didn't have to travel so far to get dialysis. He was involved in the very, 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 very long move towards trying to get an organ donor registry, led the government in 2008, when Martin would have been on the board, had determined that legislation around organ donation was going to be a government priority. And it was actually only in June of this year that the legislation commenced, the relevant piece of the legislation commenced. But he was as far as kind of going into the Oireachtas Health Committee and presenting on behalf of the Kidney Association. You can see a couple of photos there. The top one is at a centre that the association has in the grounds of Beaumont Hospital, which is the National Kidney Transplant Hospital. And Martin would have been part of the group that kind of oversaw the building of this facility. And it's accommodation for patients who are going to Beaumont for clinic appointments and for families of patients who are maybe called for transplant and want to be close to their loved one whilst they're recovering. And we're currently actually undergoing a major renovation project on site, a very massive budget being spent on it at the moment, but it's trying to future-proof it for that it'll be kind of a long-term legacy for all. So Martin was always keen to share his interest in archaeology, and he wrote a very interesting article in our quarterly magazine back in 2012 to kind of share how he navigated his career whilst also dealing with diabetes and kidney failure. And like he was very much involved in the Balhura Hills project, like with the fieldwork, was in the early 90s, and subsequently there was a lot of kind of follow-up work. I think it was 12 years of follow-up work afterwards, but Martin's involvement was disrupted by his health. He had to step away from it. But happily, when he got his transplant, he was able to come back to it. And it was nice just rereading this piece and seeing that he actually dedicated the report on the Balhura Hills project to his brother and to his transplant surgeon, David Hickey. Now, those who follow GAA might remember David Hickey from the 70s, from the all-conquering Dublin team. But David actually did, I think it was around 1,500 transplants during his career. And the most amazing thing about him was he seemed to be able to remember every single one of them. I actually had the opportunity only last week to visit him in his house to catch up with him. He's obviously retired a number of years now, but he could place each and every person, and clearly had an impact on Martin's life, in that Martin wanted to dedicate the publication to him. So again, kind of, I mentioned legacy before. I mentioned the O'Kelly name before. And in 2018, I'll never forget it, we were in the office, myself and our CEO in Donor House. And this letter arrived by recorded delivery. And we just took it in and sort of, gosh, I wonder what this is, and opened it up. And it was from a solicitor's office saying and Elizabeth O'Kelly was leaving €6 million to the Irish Kidney Association, which is the equivalent of about 4 years' turnover. So you can imagine we kind of sat there and went, oh, wow, we can do a lot with this. we can do some serious transformation. But without absolute definitive proof, we're fairly confident that it was Martin's relationship with the O'Kelly family that kind of triggered this legacy that has been quite transformative over the last 7 years. And so that's just a little bit about Martin. And I, for one, as I say, I knew him for 10 to 12 years. He was in the association about 10 years before I joined, and I still have very fond memories of working alongside him on a variety of projects, and just kind of working under his leadership as well. He was a good guy, and it brings a smile to my face each year when you guys have this event to remember him, because he's one definitely worth remembering. And thank you.
Thanks ever so much, Colin. That was great to see, and yeah, that's quite a legacy to have left to the country. It's one that I have to say the work has continued down in the Irish Kidney Association since then. And I know whenever we were talking about this before, the Kidney Association is always glad to receive the help of patrons, if anybody who has a donation or would like to support its work. But equally, the Kidney Association is also very keen to help those who need the help too. And that has been such an impressive thing of what you've been working on, which is about that help that's given. So for everybody that's online, if you have the opportunity, either with the Irish Kidney Association or if you're beyond these borders, similar associations in your own territories that do fabulous work and need that ongoing support. So Colin, thanks very much. So I'm going to move from that part of Martin's legacy now into a particular part then for the archaeologists, I guess, which is that Martin had a very particular knowledge of and made a very particular contribution to our understanding of the Bronze Age in Ireland. And that's a theme which we've kind of returned to this year in terms of the presentation. So I'm going to embarrass Jo briefly here in terms of some of her honours and background. But it is a great pleasure and an honour to introduce Professor Joanna Brück. I know that many of you online will either know Joanna directly or again through her work. So as a student, she read archaeology and anthropology at the University of Cambridge, was an undergraduate and then as a successful PhD student. She's a professor of archaeology at the University College Dublin, was previously professor of archaeology at the University of Bristol. Now, in addition to her academic day roles, she's a member of the Royal Irish Academy, having been elected to that academy in 2023. And this year, in 2025, she was elected to the British Academy, reflecting the national and international respect and regard for the work that Joanna has conducted, and her international reputation in the study of Bronze Age Britain and Ireland. Now, I know that Joanna is a very busy person, and as a member of the board of the Discovery Programme, has both this time around and in previous instances, has provided very generously of her time and knowledge to this organisation and to researchers that are involved in work both in the Bronze Age and in other periods. She's an editor of the Archaeological Dialogues, which is an international journal published by Cambridge University Press, and was previously vice president of the Prehistoric Society. And as we'll see in the talk this evening, aspects of Joanna's research interests these include the treatment of the human body and the concepts of self, the role of objects and the relationship between space and society, domestic architecture and the organisation of the landscape. So we're going from quite small to quite big interests of the world around us. Joanna has also obtained major research grants as a principal investigator, including Animals and Society in Bronze Age Europe, the ANSOC project, funded by the European Research Council. She conducted the Archaeology of the Irish Revolution, funded by the Irish Research Council, which is now known as Research Ireland. Pardon me. Let me cough for a moment. Alongside other significant research projects on the Bronze Age and many things in between. She studied the social context of technology, non-ferrous metalworking, later prehistoric Britain and Ireland, which is funded by the Labour Human Trust. The Power of Relics and the Creation of Human Bone in the Bronze Age, which is a project funded by the Gerda Henkel Foundation. And her main areas of research is Bronze Age Britain and Ireland, particularly around gender, kinship, personhood, and the social roles of material culture, settlement, and landscape. Now, her publications also then reflect that very, very broad background, with particular interest in the Bronze Age and again into 20th century and contemporary histories. So, books that you can keep an eye out for are around about personifying prehistory, relational ontologies in Bronze Age Britain and Ireland, published in Oxford University Press in 2019. The social context of technology and non-ferrous metalworking in later prehistoric Britain and Ireland, which was co-authored with Leo Webley and Sophie Adams, published by Prehistoric Society in 2020. And in our more recent work, Making 1916, The Material and Visual Culture of the Easter Rising, which is published at Liverpool University Press. Now, throughout this time, and as many of you will also know, Joanna has demonstrated her commitment to the active knowledge exchange with non-academic partners. Those who are active in and she's been active in the management of conferences and engagement with archaeologists and non-archaeologists who are working in museums, national heritage organisations, local government, archaeological consultancies, and people who are interested in the subjects and the role that she's involved in. So for the Martin Doody lecture this evening, the talk is based on research that Professor Brück is conducting or carrying out with Anwen Cooper of Oxford Archaeology, and is examining animal remains from early Bronze Age mortuary contexts. And as you'll have seen from the advertisement for the talk this evening, previously animal remains from these kind of contexts have been interpreted primarily in relation to human strategies and needs. For example, food, wealth, or symbols of power. Now, in contrast, the talk this evening was going to explore what happens when we think of animals as sentient, social beings who engage in a meaningful interspecies relationships. That is, relationships that require mutual acknowledgement, communication, and regard. They aren't simply there, but they are present. I mean, those who have engaged with them are also aware that they're there and present. And in fact, the deposition of complete and partial animal bodies, as well as objects made from animal remains, demonstrates that animals were very much active participants in the co-construction of early Bronze Age worlds. So I'm very pleased to hand over now to Professor Joanna Brück for the 2025 Martin Doody Memorial Lecture, where she will speak about animal kin, animal others in early Bronze Age Britain. So, Joanna, over to you.
Thanks very much, John, and thanks to Colin also. I'm hoping that I can make the technology work. So we'll give it a go. Now, is that full screen for you folks there?
Perfect.
Good. Okay, I'm just going to go forwards one and say, oh, no, it's not going to let me move. It's the next challenge. Okay. Promising? Okay.
Oh, there you are.
Good. Yeah. Fingers crossed. Fingers crossed. Okay, we'll see how it goes. Okay, so I'm really honoured to have been asked to deliver the annual Martin Doody lecture. I remember meeting Martin as a young lecturer myself, and when he was working at the Discovery Programme in the early 2000s, and I really enjoyed and appreciated his work on Bronze Age houses and settlements, particularly his excavations at Chancellor's Land and Kirkatour, which did so much to advance our knowledge of everyday life in the Bronze Age, a period that until then was dominated by studies of artefacts rather than settlements and landscapes. And it's in this spirit that I'd like to offer some thoughts on an aspect of the early Bronze Age. You'll have to forgive me for talking about the island over the water, but I hope that a lot of the ideas that I want to develop this evening would be just as applicable in an Irish context. Animal bones, I'm just going to move this. Let me see, move that up out of the way. Animal bones are some of the most common finds from early Bronze Age mortuary contexts. However, unlike other categories of grave goods, such as bronze, gold, or amber, or even the remains of the human dead, they attract relatively little attention. They're framed primarily in terms of the purposes they served for the human dead and their mourners. For example, their value to people as food, wealth, or symbols. So, for instance, the burnt remains of animals found in cremation burials are interpreted as food offerings for the dead, while items like boar's tusks, found in the graves of men in many regions of Europe, are seen as reflections of hunting prowess and by extension as symbols of masculine power. In contrast, in this paper, I want to try to consider animals as animals. Finds of animal remains from early Bronze Age sites strongly indicate that people viewed animals as sentient social beings and that they engaged in meaningful interspecies relationships that required mutual acknowledgement, communication, and regard. I'll consider what happens when we think of animals as active participants in the co-construction of early Bronze Age worlds and as conscious beings with their own projects and intentions. I'll examine how ways of understanding animals emerge from particular histories of embodied interaction, generating forms of classification that may have been quite different to our own. And, of course, as John already kindly mentioned, I want to add that I've been working on this topic with my colleague Anwen Cooper of Oxford Archaeology, so the ideas presented here are very much a joint effort. Let me see if I can make this go forwards. There we are. Okay, wonderful. The association between human and animal bodies in many early Bronze Age contexts, particularly mortuary contexts, is striking. Sometime between 2200 and 1960 BC, the body of a young woman aged around 25 to 29 years was wrapped in the hide of a brown cow and buried in a cist at Langwell Farm, Strathoikel, Highland. A couple of centuries later, and at the other end of Britain on Whitehorse Hill in Devon, the cremation burial of a young adult, aged between 15 and 25 years old, and possibly female, yielded a series of extraordinary organic objects. Beneath the cremation was a composite textile object of woven nettle fibres, skillfully edged with calfskin beading and a decorative fringe of calfskin triangles. Next to the cremation deposit was a lidded basket made of lime bast, bundle coiled and sewn together with cattle hair. A striped effect was created around the rim of the basket by alternating bands of dark cattle hair against the light-coloured lime bast. And inside the basket was a unique braided armband made of cattle hair from the tail of one or more animals. It comprised interlaced paired strands with a bobble terminal, and it was decorated with tin studs carefully inserted along its length. Now, cattle bone dominates most early Bronze Age faunal assemblages, and organic residue analysis of ceramics from sites of the period indicates high levels of milk consumption. It's widely recognized in the ethnographic and ethnohistoric literature that pastoralist and farming communities understand and respond to animals as part of their social and emotional worlds. Milking cattle prior to mechanization involved intimate embodied interaction. Cattle recognize human individuals, responding to their touch, smell, and voice, and will often only let down their milk for people they know and like. In 19th and 20th century, early 20th century Scotland, for example, these everyday haptic connections resulted in deep bonds between people and individual animals. Cattle were named, they were sung to, their genealogies were known, and their aesthetic traits, coat colour, the shape of their horns, were praised and celebrated in song and poetry. Activities like milking cattle or seasonal patterns of mobility such as transhumance are often strongly gendered and linked to particular age groups so that human and animal identities are bound together. At Langwell Farm, the wrapping of the young woman in the warm, bloody hide of a cow she may have known in life, for the presence of particular insects suggests it was fresh and not tanned, underlines the identity of human and animal bodies. The Whitehorse Hill armband, too, speaks of intimate relations. Braiding binds things together and makes them stronger. The repetitive pattern encircling the arm spoke of the unbreakable bond between people and their herds, of the generative power of milk in a pastoral economy, and of the particular relationship between this young woman and this particular cow. Encircling the wrist is an intimate act of enchainment, and plaiting is a meditative, even therapeutic action, the kind of activity we can imagine being undertaken on a warm summer's afternoon while the cattle were being watched and before the evening's milking. Deep familiarity with cattle behaviour and preferences is evident in the armband and its lime-bast container too, as well as the nettle textile laid beneath the human body. Tails are an instrument of communication and a visually arresting part of any animal body. Cattle raise and swish their tails in different ways when they're curious or excited, or when they're about to calve. Nettles grow best in disturbed and phosphate-rich ground. They're botanical signifiers of the presence and history of cattle in the landscape. Lime trees are also eaten by cattle as they browse in woodland. The affordances of the technologies employed to make these objects thus bound together animals, materials, people, and landscape. Now, of course, organic remains are very rare, but such relationships can also be seen in the deposition of animal bone, a much more common component of the archaeological record. A shared sense of identity and recognition of the sentient other is evident in the prevalence of complete and fragmentary animal skulls and related iconic animal elements such as tusks, horns, and antlers, in many cases deposited in close proximity to the heads, skulls of the human dead. Perhaps the best known example is the extraordinary deposit of 185 cattle skulls stacked 3 or 4 deep on top of the Barrow 1 at Earthlingborough in Northamptonshire. Barrow 75 at Low Farm in East Yorkshire yielded a dog skull which lay on top of the grave of a child. At Kneep, on the island of Lewis, 3 fragments of boar's tusks, one of which was perforated, were found together with the tooth of a seal next to the skull of an adolescent possible male. Just as fragments of human bodies, particularly skulls, were buried with the newly deceased, such bodily juxtapositions may have been a way of recognizing kinship with animals. This slippage between human and animal identities has previously been recognized in so-called head and hooves deposits, thought to represent the burial of a hide with the extremities of the body left attached. It's been suggested that these may have been worn as a garment, a means of taking on animal qualities, moving between different states of being or assuming the form of animal ancestors. Such garments might have been worn by ritual specialists, important mourners, or even the deceased themselves during a particular phase of the mortuary rite. Although most head and hooves deposits have been recovered from graves, the over-representation of cattle teeth and foot bones from the ditch surrounding the barrow at Barrow Clump in Wiltshire hints that here hides may have been displayed or deposited on the mound itself. In a context where the temperaments and histories of individual animals were known, display of their hides and heads may have acted as a powerful statement that drew attention to the identities and relationships of both the human and animal dead. Get that out of the way. The possible parallels between human and animal selves are perhaps most clearly shown in the sometimes similar treatment of human and animal bodies. At Down Farm in Dorset, a pond barrow was the focus for a series of human and animal burials. These included the cremated remains of 5 adults and 3 children, and the inhumation burials of a further 4 children. In addition to the humans, 2 cattle were deposited in diametrically opposed pits. Both were adult females and lay on their left sides. The cow in the southeastern pit, which you can see here, was of considerable age. Such an animal was no doubt intimately known to those who lived with her, particularly the person who laid their head against her flank morning and evening during milking. Indeed, this cow herself might have been the kind of matriarch who assumed the role of herd leader, for cattle are social animals who transmit knowledge intergenerationally. Just within the northern and southern edges of the pond barrow, also in diametrically opposed positions, were the bodies of 2 sheep, again both adult females. Lines drawn between each pair of burials bisect at the centre of the barrow, indicate careful positioning of these deposits. Such burials foreground the interconnection of human and animal ancestry and speak of interspecies kinship, kinship resulting not just from everyday proximities, but also from the exchange of animals in key life cycle rites, for example, as part of marriage transactions or mortuary prestations. Excuse me. Now, we could, of course, argue that animal remains were predominantly arranged with reference to human bodies in the grave, and that this shows an ontological disparity between the two. For example, a young pig and 2 sheep or goats were placed at the feet of an inhumation burial in Barrow 172 on Calais Wold, East Yorkshire. The heads of every occupant of this grave were oriented to the north-northwest, although the person was laid on its left side and the animals on their right sides, so that they mirror one another. The deposition of animals in mortuary contexts need not imply their objectification, however. It's been argued that Bronze Age grave goods were often seen as having a spirit or soul, with analogous life cycles to those of people. Likewise, human bodies were also arranged with reference to each other in mortuary contexts. Disarticulated fragments of ancestral bone were often included in later burials. For example, a grave containing the articulated inhumation burial of a young adult from Barrow 229 on Hogate Wold, East Yorkshire, had been enlarged so that a deposit of disarticulated and commingled unburnt human and red deer bones could be placed at its knees. The arrangement of different things in the grave was thus a means of establishing relational forms of identity rather than marking ownership or control. So far, we've discussed the link between animals and people, but now let's consider the relationship between different animals. One of the most extraordinary aspects of the animal bone assemblages from early Bronze Age contexts is the high percentage of wild species. Surprising, perhaps, given that farming is usually assumed to be well established by this point in prehistory. Red and roe deer are the most common wild animals, second only to cattle and more common than the other domesticated species. Interestingly, there are striking parallels in the treatment of cattle and deer, particularly in the predominance of bodily elements relating to the head. At Hemp Knoll in Wiltshire, for example, a cattle head and hooves deposit was carefully placed in the southeast corner of the grave pit, while a shed antler tine from a roe deer was deposited on the western side of the same feature. Out beyond the mortuary context, the bodies of deer and cattle could also be treated in similar ways. At Peterstone in Gwent, scatters of artifacts and animal bones were found in and around a series of Bronze Age post alignments crossing paleo channels in the salt marshes of the Severn estuary. These included a deer skull deposited next to one post alignment and the skull of a young cow at the southern end of another. Certain categories of artifact were made interchangeably from antler or cattle bone and horn. The pommels and hilts of early Bronze Age daggers were commonly made of these materials. At Barrow Hills in Oxfordshire, Grave 11 in Barrow 1 contained a tightly packed deposit of cremated bone, representing the remains of an adult male. Carefully laid on top of this were a bronze knife dagger. It appears to have had an antler hilt and a horn pommel. Indeed, the wrapping of both daggers and the human dead in cattle hide is intriguing. It's often been argued that bladed weapons were understood to possess their own vitality and power, their biographies closely intertwined with the biographies of the people with whom they were buried. Here, then, animal materials underscore the relational links between different types of beings. There are also intriguing parallels in the way aurochs and domesticated cattle were treated. Skinning marks on 2 aurochs phalanges from the assemblage of animal bone from the ditch and mound of the Barrow Clump in Wiltshire hint that there may have been an aurochs hide amongst the cattle hides deposited on this monument. At Brooklands Farm in Bedfordshire, a large pit contained the skulls of 5 aurochs and 1 domesticated cow. This hints that early Bronze Age animal classifications don't map so neatly onto our own binary distinction between the domestic and the wild. Now, we've talked a lot about cattle, but quite a lot less about the other domesticates. Although the remains of sheep and pigs do occur in early Bronze Age mortuary contexts, they're significantly less common than cattle, with the notable exception of boar's tusks, which are fairly frequently found. Again, however, there's clear evidence for deliberate selection of particular animal elements. Burnt animal bone from cremation burials tends to belong to sheep or pigs rather than cattle. For example, a large pit at the centre of the timber circle at Sarny Bryn Caled, Powys, contained 2 cremation burials both of which were accompanied by the burnt forelimbs and ribs of pigs, while a multiple cremation burial at Harlan Bay in Cornwall yielded burnt fragments of ovicaprid, sheep or goat bone, alongside the remains of at least one human adult and 4 children. Although such finds can be interpreted as the remains of funerary feasts or offerings for the dead, the bodily commingling of the bones suggests, at the very least, a sense of corporeal affinity. Nurturing animals creates bonds which can result in grief when they're killed, but it is this that makes the animal's sacrifice meaningful. One particularly striking pattern is that the small bone tools and ornaments associated with dressing or decorating the human body are most commonly made from the bones of sheep or goat. These include points, pins, awls, tweezers, toggles, and beads. At Over Longholm Drove in Cambridgeshire, for example, 4 burnt bone artifacts were recovered from the cremation burial of a mature adult female, including 2 points fashioned from ovicaprid metatarsals and 2 beads made from sections of ovicaprid tibia. Interestingly, sheep with steppe ancestry appeared during the Bronze Age elsewhere in Europe, mirroring ancestry change in human populations in this period. It's possible that cattle may have been understood to have had ancestral connections to the places and landscapes inhabited by animals like aurochs and deer, whereas sheep may have given material form to new kin networks. Although the objects made from the bones of sheep, such as pins and points, may relate to the production and use of cloth, such as possibly wool, as yet there's little evidence for the use of wool in early Bronze Age Britain. In contrast to animals like sheep, dogs are often represented by complete skeletons or skulls. East of Northdown Barn near Weymouth, the unburnt body of a dog was deposited immediately above an in-situ funerary pyre. Dogs are also frequently associated with women and children. At Low Farm in East Yorkshire, for example, the skull of a dog was placed on top of a grave containing the inhumation burial of a child. In a landscape where wolves and bears were still present, dogs no doubt played a key role in the common project of sustaining the well-being of people and their herds. The level of understanding and communication required to work effectively together perhaps goes some way towards explaining the deposition of skulls in such contexts, for these may have been viewed as the locus of animal selfhood. Alongside deer, a wide variety of other animals were also deposited in early Bronze Age graves. We find pins made of bird bone, including iconic animals like cranes and golden eagles, and pendants made from the teeth of beavers, seals, boars, and wolves, reflecting, no doubt, the charisma of these animals and a profound knowledge of particular animal behaviours. For example, the cremated remains of the young woman from Whitehorse Hill were wrapped in a bear skin. A flute fashioned from the long bone of a crane was found with the primary cremation burial in Wilsford Barrow G23 in Wiltshire. 16 wolf and 2 dog canines were found in a group at the ankle of the primary inhumation burial in Barrow G1, South Newton, Wiltshire. A single wolf tooth was found amongst the cremated remains of a child at Hutton Cranswick in East Yorkshire, whilst the cremation burial of another child at Eynsham in Oxfordshire yielded a pin made from the phalanx of a golden eagle. 2 golden eagle talons were recovered from the cremation burial of a 9-year-old child at Skilmafilly, Aberdeenshire. They were burnt, suggesting they'd accompanied the child onto the pyre. The association of large predators like wolves and eagles with children is intriguing. Like dogs, these animals may have been seen as playing a protective or apotropaic role for the very young. We've already mentioned the selection of sheep metacarpals to make items like pins and toggles, and there's evidence that the bones of wild animals too were selected for specific purposes. The use of bone from whales and other sea mammals to create the pommels of early Bronze Age daggers has been examined by Sonia O'Connor, for example. Nestled in its calfskin sheath, the bronze dagger that accompanied an inhumation burial at Forteviot, Perth and Kinross, had a horn hilt and a pommel made from the tooth of a sperm whale decorated with a band of sheet gold. Such materials perhaps evoked the power of the sea and the charisma of large sea mammals. Boar's tusks, as I've already mentioned, are a relatively common component of beaker assemblages. At Biddenham Loop in Cambridgeshire, the inhumation burial of an adult male was accompanied by a boar's tusk, a copper knife dagger with an antler pommel, a stone wrist guard, 2 barbed and tanged arrowheads, and a beaker pot. Often it was the right tusk that was selected for use. This was the case for all 4 of the tusks from the well-known Amesbury Archer burial that I think I had on my opening slide. Both daggers, with their components of antler and whalebone, and boar's tusks are predominantly found with men, suggesting gendered associations with particular animals, as others have also noted. In some cases, the animals incorporated into early Bronze Age mortuary contexts may have been hunted for their pelts or feathers. A fox metatarsal and pine marten phalanges found in the grave at Gristhorpe, North Yorkshire, may be the remains of fox and pine marten furs with the paws attached. Of course, the use of skins and teeth may have extended beyond a purely decorative or functional role. This is nicely illustrated by the treatment of the remains of beavers. Although it's entirely possible that these animals were hunted for their pelts, only beaver incisors were selected for deposition in early Bronze Age mortuary contexts. For example, the inhumation of an older adult female from Langton in North Yorkshire was accompanied by a really interesting collection of objects, including a worked beaver's tooth, a worked boar's tusk, 3 copper alloy awls, a jet bead, a fragment of pierced animal tooth, a fossil fish vertebra, a fragment of fossil belemnite, 3 cowrie shells, and 2 shell beads. These objects were found together in a cluster in front of her waist and may originally have been contained in a bag. Assemblages of this sort have often been interpreted as materials with magical properties belonging to ritual specialists. The inclusion of a beaver incisor in this assemblage hints that early Bronze Age people recognized animal agency and intentionality, the knowledge and purposeful action required to realize effective projects, such as the construction of beaver dams. Assemblages like that from Langton are notable for the way in which they bring different species together. Depositional practices focusing on barrow ditches often bring a particularly wide variety of animals into conversation. At Twyford Down in Hampshire, concentrations of animal bone were found in the same segments of the barrow ditch as the human burials, suggesting that they were particular foci for depositional practice. Finds include a horse mandible from the northern ditch of Terminal, a complete goat, and the articulated forelimb of a cow, as well as the disarticulated bones belonging to cattle, sheep, goat, pig, horse, dog, badger, red deer, roe deer, wildcat, fox, raven, duck, various smaller birds, and freshwater fish. Barrows, of course, were encountered at key moments in the journeys of the living and the dead. They structured time and space and provided a context in which understandings of the world and the place of humans within this could be given material form. Animals, too, needed to be located in these cosmographies. Such multi-species assemblages can also be seen in the context of the role of barrows in enfolding relational landscapes. The deliberate selection of materials from different meaningful places to build barrow mounds has often been noted in previous studies. How then might early Bronze Age communities have encountered and lived with animal others in this multi-species world? Beginning with the animals most commonly found at such sites, cattle, we can see that the mortuary context from which their remains have been recovered are often in landscapes through which people and their herds might regularly have moved. The young woman from Langwell Farm, for example, was buried on the banks of the River Oikel. This was an important routeway into the uplands, and travel along it may have marked important moments in the seasonal cycle, for example, as people and animals journeyed to summer grazing. Watering cattle or following the herds between lowland and upland pastures are the kinds of daily and seasonal rhythms that are central to the development of interspecies relationships and collective identities. Joint, goal-oriented activities such as moving together to new pastures require communication, collaboration, and shared cultural knowledge. Animals are familiar with such temporal rhythms and may themselves take the initiative when it is time to move, so that the cultural landscapes of the early Bronze Age, in which routeways were often marked by barrows, were the product of the collective action of people and animals. The later Neolithic and early Bronze Age mortuary monument complex at Forteviot was also located on the banks of a river, in this case the Water of May. This location was the focus of a variety of ceremonial and mortuary activities from around 3000 BC, including the construction of a palisaded enclosure, a timber circle, and 2 henge monuments. As at other monument complexes, there may have been a seasonal element to gatherings at this site, as people came together not only for particular festivities and rituals, but also in the context of regular cycles of movement with animals through the landscape. Bunches of meadowsweet were deposited in the cist grave of a man cut into the ditch of one of the henge monuments. Meadowsweet grows well in damp, nutrient-rich grasslands close to water, exactly the kinds of environments in which cattle thrive. As we've already seen, this burial was accompanied by a dagger with a cattle horn hilt and calf skin sheath, and the body may also have been wrapped in a cowhide. Activities at the monument complex might thus have included the exchange of animals and animal elements like hides, for example, as part of mortuary prestations, marriage transactions, and so on, creating shared histories of mobility and interspecies kinship. Other forms of collaboration with animals may also have been important at this site. The cist had a huge capstone, which you can see there in the bottom left, some 4 tons in weight. This was probably quarried from the banks of the Water of May, 700 meters to the south, and hopefully you can just about see that at the bottom of the little map. It's possible that animal traction was employed to move this stone. If so, cooperative labor towards a common purpose requires sensitivity to the expectations, intentions, and capacities of the other, creating a collective that is more than the sum of its human, animal, and material components. The relationship between mobility, animals, and the dead is reflected in the location of many barrow cemeteries in extensive grassland and heathland landscapes. The creation of such landscapes is widely documented across Northwest Europe at this time. Mark Houghton and Mette Löfschall have highlighted the role of animals in creating and maintaining these newly open landscapes. They argue that the construction of barrow alignments ensured that encounters with ancestors were a core component of daily and seasonal patterns of mobility. Many barrows were built from turfs, so that it was grazing that created the materials from which monuments were constructed. They suggest that ancestral relations were key to facilitating inter-community access to shared grazing resources through acts of collaborative labor in the construction of barrows and, I would argue, the tending of animals. The appearance of sheep with different genetic ancestry during this period may be linked to the expansion of open landscapes, as sheep are grazers who require and themselves help to create and maintain exactly these kinds of environments. It's therefore all the more intriguing that animals that prefer woodland environments, such as deer and boar, are so well represented in early Bronze Age mortuary contexts. Perhaps the clearance of woodland in the early Bronze Age brought these animals out into the open, so that the shifting woodland-pasture interface became a particularly intense point of contact and perhaps conflict at this time. Previous work has tended to focus on the possible symbolism of animals like deer or boar, the potential of their remains to evoke qualities or values, such as courage, violence, or strength, that might have been applied to construct gendered identities for the dead. However, although encounters with wild animals may have occurred with less frequency than everyday interaction with domesticates, it's worth considering the embodied experience of hunting, the deep familiarity with animal habits and characters it requires, and the sense of wonder and magic, fear and elation generated in moments of intense connection that such encounters can inspire. So, the power of objects that perhaps served as amulets, such as the teeth of wolves or talons of birds of prey, or components of clothing worn by ritual specialists or others, such as animal furs or hides, derived not from abstract symbolism, but from human-animal interaction and the observed behavior of particular animals, both wild and domestic. Thus, the use of animal bones and other animal materials, both in everyday life and in the mortuary context, allowed the transference of particular qualities between human and animal bodies based on lived relationships and connections with these other animal beings. Animals are often sidelined in accounts of the early Bronze Age, forming just one component of the background to human action in our imagined reconstructions of early Bronze Age society. Partly, of course, this is because most archaeologists hail from urban environments, far removed from the everyday demands and interdependencies of farming. but partly also because the colonial history of our discipline has resulted in the marginalizing and objectification of the other than human. Here, in contrast, I've tried to consider what might happen if we recenter animals in our narratives, both as companions and collaborators in the project of Bronze Age sociality, though no doubt they could be uncooperative and obstructive too, and also as beings with their own capacities, temperaments, and desires, to which early Bronze Age people had to be attuned in order to live well in this multi-species world, something I'm sure that will be familiar to anyone in the audience who shares their home with an animal. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joe. For everybody then that has come along this evening too, thank you all very, very much for your time tonight and for sticking with us for this evening. Thank you. The technical glitch which didn't last very long here. I had just taken everybody out of these meetings at the end, but I am going to give you a few moments then just to sort of leave before I press the big leave button. Thank you all very much. If you keep an eye on our social media and on our website, we'll have some presentations in the new year, all being well, about her own work in the Discovery Programme. Just some more updates in terms of ongoing research activities that we have. And then looking forward into next year for the Martin Doody Lecture 2026. But for now, thanks everybody. We'll wish you a happy Christmas because we're now into December, and wish us all the best. Cheerio.